Hello, welcome to the EFM podcast, EFM Voice. The purpose of this podcast is to provide the EFMP highlights from the 2021 Military Family Caucus Summit that took place on Thursday, 14 October 2021. The Congressional Military Family Caucus recognizes that when a service member joins the military, it is not a job, it is a family commitment to our country. Each year, the caucus hosts an annual summit to address the challenges faced by America's military families. This year, U.S. Representative Sanford Bishop from Georgia and Kathy McMorris Rogers from Washington co-chaired. The featured speaker was Dr. Jill Biden. We just want to summarize the EFMP highlights because we represent EFMP voices. And today, we have two wonderful co-hosts, Austin Carrig, the CEO and founder of Exceptional Families in the Military, and Jennifer Barnhill from Partners in Promise.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming, Jennifer. We're so excited to have you here, and we do not want to delay the podcast any further. So we're going to let you jump in to the very first panel, which you were featured on.
Thanks. It was awesome. So this was actually a new topic for the panel for the caucus. It was called Modern Military Families. And okay, that could be really, really broad, right? So what we really focused on was how do we even begin to understand what a modern military family is, and how can we learn to pivot to the needs of a modern military family. And so the thing that I ended up talking about is something that really hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. It's how do we connect as military spouses? And often we find these points of relevance and connection through military spouse groups. That's the traditional way that families have found connection to resources, to support structures, things like that. And so I really looked at how that relates to our modern military family, because often we're working, we have children to care for clearly, and there's so much going on. So is that structure still relevant? And so that was the topic of the first panel. We had also Berenice Castillo joined, and if you don't know who Berenice is, she heads up an organization that focuses on giving mentorship for military spouses. We also had Blue Star Families, Jennifer Aiken, talk about the statistics behind a lot of these things. And so it was a really great panel. And I'm just sorry, I didn't mention Berenice Castillo is from Military Spouse Advocacy Network. And we really had a great time putting that panel together. I highly recommend you tune into it if you have a chance. And then you want me to just jump right in and go to the next panel? The next panel that was featured in the caucus was education. And clearly we have a lot of stakeholders here who are very interested in education. We had a variety of speakers. One of them was a military family member who's also an advocate. And so Alicia Pepper shared her story about her advocacy in Colorado. And I don't know about you guys, can I just ask, had you heard about anything that she'd done before the caucus? Austin?
So honestly, I had not heard about it. So it was really interesting listening to her tell us about how she'd been fighting for this bill, and that she really wanted to support these military families, and how she really pulled the community together. I thought it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was great. And so she just shared her story of how she made legislation happen, which was so encouraging to hear. It's not just, an organization that's capable of doing this. You can do this as an individual spouse. So that was really great to hear. We also heard from New Mexico State Senator Harold Pope Jr. He is an Air Force veteran, and he is working on a lot of legislation also to help support our students. A lot of that was due to early enrollment. We also talked about his future goals of having advanced enrollment, not just early enrollment for military kiddos. And then the last presenter for the education panel was my boss, Michelle Norman. She rocked it, talking about special education and the struggles that our families face. She did give a couple sneak peeks into our data from our survey. And so I think that another must tune in panel from my point of view.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Rebecca, do you want to lead into the next panel on childcare?
Sure, Austin. Thank you. I was a panel member for childcare as a former dual military couple. Also cross-service couple, as my husband is Army and I was Air Force. However, the other panelists on there was Ethan Branch, who came from Fort Benning representing the Army, and then Crystal Pillow representing Child Care Aware of America. And the focus was childcare in general, but I just want to highlight the EFMP specifics. And one of those things is when you have a child with special needs, you are pointed towards resources that really don't help you with childcare, right? You're pointed towards TRICARE Echo as a answer to help you with your home healthcare situation. But in pretty much every branch, respite service, care, as well as TRICARE Echo, those services cannot be used for childcare. You have to have a person in the home when you are getting those services. So it is a barrier for special needs families in general, and it makes it very hard when you're dual military, a single military member, or even a dual working household to continue your service when you have a special needs child. So really, I think the focus of the child care panel really ties into the modern military family, honestly, and how are we looking at families today? How are families structured today? And the archaic systems that are in place with the military really don't support those dynamics. And if we really want to have a diverse force, we need to support the programs that are going to apply to the modern family, not the typical one person is a service member and the other person stays at home and cares for the kids. So that's just a quick summary of the EFMP issue associated with childcare from my perspective. Although I want to add that the CDCs are the child development centers in general on the bases. There is a process for you to get your care there for your special needs child, but it varies wildly on what is available. And that's why a focus of the panel was really talking about civilian community care and how to bring that into the military to provide more options for military family members to get care, especially those with special needs, because if you're dealing with a feeding tube or any other kind of issue, it could be hard to be seen on base. And it can hard even to be seen in the community or to get care in the community. But what you really, are looking for is different options. So could it be available on base? Maybe we could change some of our programs to support EFMP families there. Maybe we could expand the pilot program, bringing au pairs or nannies into the home to assist with childcare there for a subsidized type program. Anyways, I'm really hopeful that as we look towards the future that the DoD will look into these options because it's really what supports a diverse force.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a great overview of childcare. Jennifer, do you think you could tell us about the spouse employment?
Sure. So as Rebecca said, there's a lot of overlap in these panels. And so I think that even though employment panel might not feel like it's for you because maybe you're a caregiver and you don't have an employment issue at the moment, a lot of these conversations really do overlap. We know from our data that our families are not in the workforce as much as they even desire to be. And so it's important for you to be plugged into employment conversations because maybe the circumstances don't allow for it now, but it might at a later time. We had a lot of really great panelists talking about employment. Some shared their personal stories of working OCONUS and having, outside of the continental United States. And for those who don't know, and just negotiating with the status of forces agreements. We had someone talking about living in Italy and kind of breaking the rules while they did so, because there was just a lot of lack of clarity on what the rules even were. So that was a really interesting panel. We also heard from Stephanie Brown, who does the Chamber of Commerce as well as the Rosie Network. And she's a nonprofit working in this space to help with employment. But there's so many resources out there. If you're interested in hearing about what's going on legislatively for military spouse employment, definitely tune into this panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. So the next panel was healthcare and EFMP. So I'll take this panel. On this panel was myself, Jennifer Dane, who represented not only the EFMP Coalition, but Modern Military Families of America. And just a heads up that she has a really great perspective that I think a lot of us haven't looked at when we talk about EFMP in general. So that was a really interesting portion of the panel. Also on the panel was Conwell Smith from the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers, Mary Thomas, who represents the Family Readiness Program for the 131st Air Refueling Wing, and Brett Tinder, who is a U.S. Defense Fellow for Representative Joe Wilson. So when we talked about this panel, obviously, I think this was probably the most EFMP intense panel. So the panel started with Mary really breaking down what is EFMP, what is ECHO, what does it mean for our families? And that is really weedy. I'm not going to give it all to you all over again because we could have a whole podcast on that. But it was an interesting synopsis, so I encourage you to go back and listen. The next person to present was me. I shared my family story on PCSing in the middle of COVID with a child with a very significant background of complex medical issues and how all of the pieces fell apart during our PCS, and it ended up very catastrophically for my little girl and my family, and that it took senior leadership to make things right, and how that really is a problem, and we need to fix this for all EFMP families, not just mine. You shouldn't have to go to leadership for a PCS to work in a way that is safe and functional for all EFMP families. Next, Jennifer Dane came on and she talked to us about how LGBTQ families oftentimes are finding themselves in this weird space between, do you need to be on EFMP? Do you not need to be on EFMP? We know that if you're transgender, you have nothing wrong with you. You just happen to identify as being transgender, but in some places you need to get mental health counseling, and part of changing your gender to the gender that you associate with can be very difficult. And when you have to sign up for medical care and say that there's something wrong with you and it's not, that has been a really complex and hard topic for families who are kind of living in that space. And so she shared that with us. Conwell Smith from the Rosalind Carter Institute talked to us about caregiving in general across all facets of life. So I know a lot of their programming is around, caregiving for the service member or for the disabled service member, but she did mention that they are really looking to branch out to see how they can support EFMP families, which I think is going to be a really natural place for them to find themselves. And I'm really looking forward to see what that programming comes out to be. Brett Tinder, I think, shared some of the most exciting news of the entire caucus, which is they are working on a new panel that has been championed by Partners in Promise to give military families on EFMP a greater voice in how EFMP processes are determined across the DoD. And the language is in the NDAA. We are very hopeful that it'll get passed. It'll provide a seat for a family member of an officer, a family member of someone who is enlisted, a member of the EFMP Coalition, which right now consists of 7 organizations, and we all represent EFMP families. And those are really big things that haven't always happened in the past. We hear frequently, there's this panel at the Office of Special Needs, and they meet with the Department of Defense and they meet with DHA and they come up with all of these programs, but the questions have always been, but who are they? If they represent us, who are they? We want to know about them and we want to know about their lives and what they're telling you, and that hasn't happened. So we're really hopeful that this panel is going to pass and we're going to get our family members there and our voices are going to be heard. So the next panel that came up was the mental health panel, and we're going to bounce this panel around us a little bit differently than we've explained some of the other panels. On this panel was Lee Kelly from Military One Source, Tracy Neal Walden from the Cohen Veterans Network, and Jessica Strong, who is a fabulous and very strong military spouse who during the panel was also going through a PCS move, which I think we can all understand. So Jennifer, I know that you had said that you'd heard part of the panel and that one of the things that was talked about was stigma as it's related to mental health. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, so Jessica opened the panel telling her personal story, and it was really great to hear because she also, I don't know if you know this about Jessica, but she has an EFMP child, so she knows a little bit about what we're going through. She's also works for Blue Star Families on their research team and is amazing at collecting data. But she shared her story about what it's like for a child to kind of move in the middle of this pandemic, and what is it like to deal with the stress that's involved, and then having a work environment that luckily for her was supportive and but at the same time it's still a strain, and the mental strain that they were going through, and so it was really interesting to hear from her, and then also to hear backed up with that is the Military OneSource resources that are available to discuss the stigmas that we're facing. Like you're an employed military spouse, you want to push full force into the future and be successful in that area of your life, but then you're also having to choose between how do you support your children, and you're dealing with the deployments and the moving and all of the stressors that are involved. And so Military OneSource is working towards getting some information to work on the stress, but also the stigma that's associated with coming forward with that stress. And I'm really excited to hear more about that program. I would highly recommend doing a deep dive onto Military OneSource and take a listen to this feature. We at Partners in Promise are all about deep diving into stigma, so I'm excited.
So the next panel is food insecurity. And on this panel, we had Representative Bishop, Georgia's 2nd Congressional District Representative in Congress, Josh Pratos, I'm sure I'm butchering your name, so I'm really sorry, from Maison, A Jewish Response to Hunger, Shannon Razadin from Military Family Advisory Network, and Bianca Szozalski, again, I'm really sorry, I know I have your name wrong, from America.
Bianca from Military Families Magazine.
Bianca, you were
Bianca. She's been elevated to a one name.
There you go. So this panel was really intriguing for a lot of reasons. I think that a lot of people don't realize that food insecurity is a real thing in America's modern military force. There are a lot of misconceptions about food insecurity within the force. I know that there had been a question at one point in the panel about Sergeant Major of the Army Grinston saying, families were food insecure because they're buying fancy boats and cars. And we know that that's not always the case. Yes, that happens sometimes, but we also know that there are families who are facing food insecurity for a variety of reasons. One of the members on the food insecurity panel did tell us that her family faced food insecurity because they had gone from being a two-income family to a single income family in a very small city in Arizona. She was unable to work, and that when her husband enlisted, they didn't realize that life was going to be the way it was, and they were too embarrassed to tell people that they were facing food insecurity, so their family was eating MREs to survive paycheck to paycheck, which I can't imagine having to feed my small children an MRE because I couldn't afford to go to the grocery store. And I think that one of the questions around this really is, what can we do to support our families who are facing food insecurity, and how is that compounded by being an EFMP family? So our copays for medications costing too much, our copays to see providers costing so much that families are having to take that out of their paychecks. I know, Rebecca, you've shared with me in the past, like super expensive issues with medical formula. Do you want to tell us about it?
Sure. When my first child was born, he had some really bad GI issues, and we ended up having to get a broken down formula for him that was very expensive. It was $35 to $40 a can, and if you've ever fed your child formula, you know that those cans don't last very long. They might last 2 days, especially when you have an infant. And it took me 6 months to get TRICARE to approve to reimburse it. Luckily, at the time, we were dual income officers and could afford it. But I kept thinking to myself, what if I was an E1, and I needed this formula, and it took 6 months to get it approved just to back pay for it, So anytime you have an allergy or some sort of other issue that is associated with food in an EFMP family, it can increase the cost of your grocery bill to an extreme amount, really, and cause food insecurity. And that's just something I want people to think about when in relation to EFMP families. On the next panel, there is housing, which I think, Austin, you have a personal experience with as well. Could you tell us about that?
So on this panel, we had Todd Ernst from PCS Grades, Elizabeth Field from the Government Accountability Office, which, you know, we all love, GAO. They go in, they do reports, and they tell the government how well they're doing at running their programs. So that was an interesting piece of the panel. Tricia Ross, a military spouse, and Colonel Joel Stanfranek from U.S. Transportation Command, or TRANSCOM, as we all call it. A few interesting things that came out of the panel is that the way our moves are booked for PCS is going to be changing in the very near future. The way contracts are awarded is going to be changing. Where you go to submit your claims during your move is changing. So the whole process is changing. We really hope that it's a change in the better. I can tell you, as an EFMP family PCSing with a child with a lot of medical equipment, every time we move, it is a catastrophic loss. All of our medical equipment is always broken, and it's the stuff that we can't take with us in the car. You know, you can't take a medical bed that TRICARE paid $13,000 for in the back of your car as you drive across the country. And so getting those claims done on the other side has been extremely difficult, and fingers crossed that this new transportation contract is going to change that for our families. As far as housing, there was a question about ADA housing and why some bases are allowed to have ADA adaptable homes instead of actual ADA homes, or why they are building homes that they call ADA accessible homes, but there are bar height counters and sinks underneath the cabinets. The panel really seemed shocked with the question. They seemed to not really understand how or why this was happening. These ADA adaptable homes had a mechanism built into the contract somehow where families are responsible for paying for the cost to modify the homes, which I think if we go back to this, you know, higher ranking families may be able to do it. Higher enlisted, higher ranking officers may be able to afford the cost to adapt these homes, but we could never ask our lower ranking soldiers to do this and to be able to afford the amount of money that it would cost to adapt these homes to be livable for their families. So we're really looking forward to seeing what's potentially in next year's NDAA to protect military families living in on-base housing when it comes specifically to ADA homes and how our EFMP families are affected during PCS moves. And that was the end of the caucus. So there was a lot to unpack from the caucus and from all of the conversations. It was a full day, and we've just given you a bite-sized piece. So obviously there are going to be things we left out, and we really apologize. Rebecca?
Well, I just have a question for you ladies. What would you like to see next year?
Well, so, you know, Rebecca, you mentioned, excuse me, Austin, you mentioned, you know, some of the shock from some of the questions. I love the question and answer period. So that was the best, that's the best part of this. So if you're bored of seeing like panelists just lecturing, this is the caucus for you, because there is an opportunity to get your questions asked. So if you don't attend next year, if you didn't get to attend this year. But the other thing I would really love to see next year is more participation from the DoD, and possibly those who can make decisions about some of these questions. I really would love to hear feedback, to hear, you know, what sparked like a plan or a policy change. You know, we know that things have come out of these caucuses, and I'm excited to see if we can get some of those updates. Like maybe we can meet back in a couple of months and see what might have come of it. Hopefully something. So I guess maybe what I would like to see in the future would be, yeah, you know, we want to see the family stories because they're really touching and impactful. I almost cried during Austin's section, but I've heard your story before, but I did cry the first time, if that helps. But I think it was really great for the panels that we were able to hear from our leaders, because I think that is the tie. You know, we can hear about the problems all day long, but if we don't have a solution to some of these problems, then we're just talking to ourselves. And so I would love to hear some from leaders.
You know, I really agree with you on that, Jennifer. And I think that when we come to leadership and we do this caucus, I would really love the opportunity to say, this is what I would propose to fix the issue, right? It's easy to say this is what's wrong, but I would love the opportunity for families to be able to propose solutions to some of the issues that are risen during the Q&A section. And I know this is a shameless plug, but if you heard something in the caucus that didn't sit right with you or left you with questions, or you want a member of Congress to know the same thing happened to you, remember that they work for you. You can reach out to them anytime you want. You can call their offices, you can find them online, you can go to our website, we'll link you to your representative, but they don't know what you want to know unless you tell them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Austin. And we will include the links for the Senate and the House, so you can find your representative if you don't know who they are, to contact them, or you don't know who they are this year because maybe you moved and changed state residencies. So thank you guys for attending. I really look forward to the future, to all of our staff and volunteers at EFM and PIP, and especially to the families we advocate for. We will continue to advocate for EFMP related issues. This year, the EFMP thread ran throughout the caucus, and we do believe our voices were heard. You're right on the solutions, though. We need those to follow through. We hope this recap was helpful for you and can arm you with some more information with your own advocacy efforts. Because legislators, they do want to hear our voices. And together, our military voices really, really matter. We're stronger together. So I don't really have anything else to say in closing comments. I'm going to open it up to Jennifer and Austin for their closing comments.
Thank you guys for having me. If anyone is interested, I wanted to take a second to actually invite you guys to join our podcast at Partners in Promise. We have disruptive storytelling podcast, and our series is currently focused on military stigma. So a lot of the things that came up in this caucus were directly related to that stigma: food insecurity, dealing with gender issues. Are you a female service member or just a spouse? All of those types of questions. Obviously, we cover EFMP and other things, but I think it would be great to get some of your stories and put those stories on our podcast. Do you guys want to come on?
Yes. Of course we do. Thank you so much for the invitation.
If anyone has any questions for me, they can reach me at jennifer@partnersinpromise.org.
And we'll link that below the podcast for everybody, as well as the link to Partners in Promise podcast, Disruptive Storytelling. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you.